The bullet hit Pablo Escobar in the neck at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, and before his bodyguard could pull a weapon, 3 men were already dead on the floor of a warehouse in Envigado. Blood ran down the collar of his shirt, soaking into the fabric of a polo that cost more than most Colombians earned in a year. Pablo pressed his hand against the wound, felt the heat, felt the wet, and looked directly at the man who'd pulled the trigger. What happened in the next 3 hours would become Medellín legend, a story whispered about for decades, a night that turned Colombia's second city into a place that smelled like gunpowder and burning rubber until dawn. But let me take you back 45 minutes, because you need to understand how Pablo Escobar, the most powerful drug lord on the planet, a man who had a $4 million bounty on his head, walked into a room with people who wanted him dead and sat down anyway. Get this, the meeting wasn't supposed to happen at all. It was 1989 and Medellín was already a pressure cooker. The Colombian government, backed by the Americans, had been squeezing the cartels for months: extradition treaties, police raids, helicopters over the barrios at 3 in the morning. Pablo had been moving between safe houses every 72 hours, never sleeping in the same bed, never eating food he hadn't watched someone else taste first. His operation was pulling in $60 million a day, but he couldn't walk down the street. He couldn't visit his family without armored vehicles and counter-surveillance teams scanning every rooftop within a mile. And then word came through a chain of intermediaries that the Cali cartel wanted to talk. Now, you have to understand something about Pablo and the Cali boys. The Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, ran cocaine out of southern Colombia, and they hated Pablo Escobar the way a landlord hates a tenant who won't leave. Pablo was loud. Pablo was violent. Pablo declared war on the Colombian state, blew up airplanes, killed judges, assassinated a presidential candidate on live television. Every time Pablo made headlines, the government cracked down harder on everyone, including Cali. The Rodriguez brothers wanted to do business quietly, bribe the right people, move product without attracting attention. Pablo was a wrecking ball swinging through their profit margins. So the message came through a mid-level trafficker named Fernando Galeano's cousin, a guy who ran legitimate car dealerships as fronts. The message was simple. Cali wanted a truce. They wanted to divide territory. They wanted to stop the bleeding on both sides, and they wanted to meet in person. Pablo's top lieutenant, a man named John Jairo Velasquez, known on the street as Popeye, told Pablo it was a trap. Popeye had killed over 250 people on Pablo's orders and had the instincts of a rattlesnake. He stood in the kitchen of a farmhouse outside Medellín, jabbed his finger at a map spread across the table and said, "They'll put a bullet in your head before you sit down." Pablo pulled the map closer, studied it for 10 seconds, then folded it in half. "If they wanted me dead, they wouldn't send a message first." Popeye shook his head but said nothing else. When Pablo decided something, you didn't argue twice. Believe me, Pablo Escobar was not a man who trusted easily. He'd survived 6 assassination attempts by that point: car bombs, sniper fire, a rocket launcher aimed at an apartment he'd left 20 minutes earlier. His security protocol was more elaborate than most heads of state. Before any meeting, his people would sweep the location, check sightlines, station armed men on rooftops and in cars on every exit route. Pablo never entered a building without knowing 3 ways out. But this meeting was different. Cali demanded neutral ground. No weapons inside the room, 2 bodyguards each, maximum, and the location would only be revealed 2 hours before the sit-down. Pablo agreed. At 8:15 p.m., a phone call came in. The meeting would be in a warehouse on the eastern edge of Envigado, a municipality south of Medellín where Pablo had grown up, where he'd built his first stash houses, where half the population owed their livelihood to his cocaine network. Pablo knew every street, every alley, every drainage ditch a man could crawl through if things went wrong. He drove in a convoy of 3 vehicles, 2 armored SUVs and a motorcycle outrider. Popeye rode in the lead vehicle. Pablo sat in the back seat of the second, wearing a navy polo shirt and light slacks, a gold watch on his left wrist, a 9mm Sig Sauer tucked into the waistband at the small of his back. The agreement said no weapons. Pablo had never once followed someone else's agreement. They arrived at 9:02 p.m. The warehouse was a concrete structure, 1 story, flat roof, loading dock on the south side, a single metal door on the north. Pablo's advance team had already been there for an hour. 2 sicarios on the roof with assault rifles. 4 more in a van parked across the street. Communications running on a frequency that was changed every 6 hours. Here's what nobody tells you. The men waiting inside weren't from Cali at all. Well, not entirely. There were 2 Cali representatives, yes. A man named Hernando Carvajal, who handled Cali's distribution in Venezuela, and his bodyguard, a thick-shouldered former military officer whose name has never been confirmed in any record I've found. But the third man in the room was the problem. His name was Diego Murillo Bejarano, but everyone called him Don Berna. And Don Berna was something far more dangerous than a Cali operative. He was a former Escobar ally who had switched sides. Don Berna had worked for Pablo's enforcement wing for years. He knew the safe house rotations. He knew the communication frequencies. He knew which cops were on the payroll and which judges had been threatened, and 6 months earlier, after Pablo had ordered the murder of Don Berna's business partner over a territorial dispute, Don Berna had quietly reached out to Cali and offered them something priceless: access. So when Pablo walked through that metal door at 9:05 p.m., flanked by Popeye and a second bodyguard named Carlos, he was walking into a room where one of the 3 men sitting at a folding table had memorized his security protocols and fed that information to people who wanted him in the ground. Pablo sat down. He didn't shake hands. He placed both palms flat on the table, fingers spread, and looked at each man for 3 full seconds. Hernando Carvajal from Cali spoke first. "We appreciate you coming. Gilberto sends his regards." Pablo said nothing. Carvajal continued. "The war is costing everyone. We're losing shipments. Routes are compromised. The Americans are picking us off because we're too busy fighting each other." "You're too busy fighting me," Pablo corrected. "I'm not losing shipments." No kidding. That was the kind of thing Pablo would say in a room full of hostile men, not to provoke, to establish that he was the one doing the choosing, the one with leverage, the one who could walk away and burn everything behind him. Don Berna shifted in his chair. Pablo's eyes moved to him. "I didn't expect to see you here, Diego." Don Berna held Pablo's stare. "Times change, Patron." Pablo's jaw tightened. He pulled his hands off the table and rested them in his lap. That word, patron. The way Don Berna said it, with just enough respect to sound like disrespect. Pablo registered it, filed it away. Carvajal talked for the next 10 minutes. Territory divisions, shipping routes, a proposed ceasefire along the Caribbean coast, revenue splits on European distribution. Pablo listened, nodded twice, asked one question about port access in Cartagena. The meeting had the surface texture of a business negotiation between mid-level executives, except that Don Berna kept glancing at the door. Popeye noticed it first. He was standing 4 feet behind Pablo's right shoulder, and he later said in an interview that Don Berna looked at that metal door 7 times in 12 minutes. Each time his eyes flicked right, then back, and each time his right hand drifted slightly toward his hip. I swear this happened. At 9:44 p.m., Pablo leaned forward and said, "Diego, are you expecting someone?" The room went quiet. Don Berna's bodyguard, a man who'd been standing motionless by the far wall, moved his hand inside his jacket. Popeye drew his weapon. Carlos drew his weapon. And in the half-second of frozen tension that followed, Don Berna pulled a compact pistol from an ankle holster and fired. The first shot hit Carlos in the chest. Carlos went down. The second shot caught Pablo on the left side of his neck, just below the ear, tearing through muscle and grazing the external jugular vein. Pablo's head snapped sideways. His chair tipped. He hit the concrete floor on his right shoulder. Popeye fired 3 rounds. 2 hit Don Berna's bodyguard's center mass. 1 hit Hernando Carvajal in the hip as Carvajal scrambled backward. Carvajal's own bodyguard pulled a weapon and fired at Popeye. The round went wide, punching a hole in the corrugated metal wall. Popeye put 2 more rounds into the bodyguard's torso. 3 men were down in under 4 seconds. Don Berna dove behind a stack of wooden pallets on the east side of the warehouse. Pablo, bleeding from the neck, rolled onto his stomach, reached behind his back, and pulled the Sig Sauer from his waistband. Let me paint this for you. Pablo Escobar is on the floor of a warehouse. He's been shot in the neck. Blood is pooling under his left hand where he's pressing against the wound. His bodyguard Carlos is dead or dying 3 feet away. Popeye is firing at a man hiding behind pallets. And Pablo, rather than crawling toward the exit, raised himself to one knee, steadied the pistol with his right hand, and started scanning for Don Berna. This is the thing about Escobar that even his enemies admitted. He was not a coward. Say whatever else you want about him, monster, murderer, terrorist, but the man did not run from a fight, not once, not ever. Don Berna fired from behind the pallets. The round cracked past Pablo's head. Pablo fired twice into the wood. Splinters flew. Don Berna moved, crawling on his belly toward the loading dock on the south side. Popeye advanced, weapon up, stepping over the bodies on the floor. He kicked the gun away from Carvajal's bodyguard, checked Carvajal, still alive, moaning, clutching his hip, and then moved toward the pallets. Pablo got to his feet. His left hand was red to the wrist. Blood was running freely down his shirt, down his arm, dripping off his fingertips onto the concrete. He swayed once, steadied himself against the table, and said to Popeye, "Don't kill him. I want him alive." Don Berna reached the loading dock door and shoved it open. Moonlight cut into the warehouse. He stumbled out onto the gravel lot, and Pablo's rooftop shooters opened fire. Bullets kicked up dust around Don Berna's feet. He dove behind a dumpster. One of the rooftop sicarios put a round through the dumpster's metal wall, and Don Berna screamed. He didn't come out. Popeye reached the loading dock. Pablo was right behind him, moving slower, his breathing labored, the wound on his neck still bleeding. Outside, the sound of engines, tires on gravel. Headlights swung across the lot, and 2 vehicles, a black sedan and a pickup truck, came screaming in from the access road. These weren't Pablo's men. You catching this? Don Berna had backup waiting outside. The pickup truck's bed had 3 men with rifles. They opened up on the rooftop, and one of Pablo's sicarios took a round and fell off the edge, hitting the gravel with a sound that Popeye later described in terms I won't repeat here. The second rooftop shooter returned fire, hitting the pickup's windshield. The truck swerved, clipped a concrete barrier, and stopped. Pablo stepped back inside the warehouse. He pulled a radio from Carlos's belt. Carlos was gone, eyes open, not breathing, and keyed the frequency. Everyone to the warehouse. Now, full response. Full response. Those 2 words meant something very specific in Pablo Escobar's organization. It meant call in every sicario, every lookout, every corner boy with a weapon. It meant war. Here's the part that makes your skin crawl. Within 12 minutes of that radio call, over 60 armed men converged on the Envigado district. Motorcycles, cars, a stolen delivery truck, men who'd been drinking in bars, watching television, sleeping in apartments. They came with Uzis, with AK-47s, with shotguns, with machetes. They set up checkpoints on major roads. They stopped vehicles and dragged out anyone they didn't recognize. And they started hunting. But first, the warehouse. The black sedan outside had disgorged 2 more gunmen who were firing at the loading dock entrance. Popeye was pinned behind a steel support column, returning fire in controlled bursts. Pablo was behind the folding table, which he'd flipped on its side, pressing a torn strip of his shirt against his neck wound. Hernando Carvajal was still on the floor, conscious, bleeding from his hip, begging in a voice that cracked like a teenager's for someone to call an ambulance. Pablo looked at Carvajal. And here's the moment that still gets me. Pablo crawled over to Carvajal, pulled off his own watch, that gold watch worth $15,000, pressed it into Carvajal's hand and said, "If you survive tonight, tell Gilberto I'll remember this. Tell him what his peace looks like." Then he crawled back behind the table and resumed firing. Think about that. The man had just been shot in the neck, was bleeding out on a warehouse floor, and he took the time to deliver a message to his enemy's boss through a dying intermediary. That wasn't rage, that was strategy. Even with a bullet wound, Pablo Escobar was playing the long game. The van across the street, the one with Pablo's 4-man backup team, finally engaged. They hit the black sedan from behind, shredding it with automatic weapons fire. One of the Cali gunmen went down in the street. The other dropped his weapon and tried to surrender. Popeye shot him from the loading dock. Don Berna was still behind the dumpster, wounded, bleeding. Pablo's men surrounded him within 3 minutes. They pulled him out by his ankles. He'd been hit in the left thigh by the round that went through the dumpster wall. He was conscious, breathing hard, his eyes wide. Popeye dragged him across the gravel and dropped him at Pablo's feet inside the warehouse. Pablo looked down at him. His neck wound was still bleeding, though slower now, the torn shirt acting as a crude compress. "You know what's wild?" Pablo didn't say a word. He stared at Don Berna for a long time. Don Berna stared back, and his lip was trembling, and there was a look on his face that was something beyond fear. It was the look of a man who understood, in his bones, that he had bet everything on one shot and missed. Pablo turned to Popeye. "Take him to La Finca. Keep him breathing." La Finca was one of Pablo's rural properties, a ranch with a basement that had been soundproofed the year before. The implication needed no explanation. Now, here is where the night transformed from a shootout into something else entirely. Something that would scar Medellín for years. Pablo got into his armored SUV. One of his men, a former paramedic who worked exclusively for the organization, cleaned the neck wound in the back seat as the convoy moved. The bullet had torn through soft tissue but missed the jugular by less than a centimeter. It had not hit the spine. It had not severed any major artery. Pablo Escobar was, by every medical measure, obscenely lucky. But luck didn't calm him down. It made him angrier. By 10:30 p.m., Pablo was at a secondary safe house in the hills above Envigado. His neck was stitched and bandaged. He was on his feet, pacing, making phone calls. And the orders he gave in the next 60 minutes rewired the entire city. First, he called his contact in the Medellín police, a colonel named Valderrama, who had been receiving $50,000 a month for 4 years. "I want to know who provided security for the Cali people tonight. I want names. I want addresses. You have 1 hour. Second, he called his network of neighborhood leaders, the men who controlled the comunas, the hillside slums that wrapped around Medellín in a belt of cinder block and corrugated tin. No one in or out of the comunas tonight. Anyone who isn't ours is a target. Third, he called his brother Roberto. "Call the families, move them, all of them, tonight." Roberto didn't ask questions. He started making calls. And then, trust me on this, Pablo did something that turned the temperature of Medellín from hot to volcanic. He ordered his sicarios to attack every known Cali-affiliated property in the city, every one. Within the next 90 minutes, 7 businesses were firebombed, 2 restaurants, a nightclub, 3 warehouses, a car dealership, gunmen on motorcycles, the infamous sicarios of Medellín, teenagers and young men from the comunas who killed for $300 a body, rolled through neighborhoods spraying bullets into storefronts. A Cali-connected money changer was dragged from his apartment in El Poblado and shot in the street. His wife, who tried to pull him back inside, was pistol-whipped and left on the sidewalk. By midnight, Medellín sounded different. Police sirens, ambulances, the pop-pop-pop of gunfire from a dozen different neighborhoods. Smoke rose from fires across the city, visible against the dark mountains that ringed the valley. Residents locked their doors. Shopkeepers pulled down metal shutters. Taxi drivers abandoned their cars and walked home. The police did nothing. Or rather, the police did exactly what Pablo's money had trained them to do. They stayed in their stations. They responded to calls slowly, if at all. Colonel Valderrama personally ordered 2 patrol units to stand down when they encountered a roadblock manned by Pablo's men on the road to Itagüí. And it wasn't just Cali targets. No way. When Pablo went to war, the collateral damage was apocalyptic. A bus was stopped at a checkpoint and searched. When one passenger, a university student with no connection to anything, panicked and ran, he was shot in the back. A family in Belen heard gunfire outside their house and hit the floor. A stray round came through their window and hit their television set. Nobody was hurt, but the father later told a reporter he didn't let his children leave the house for a week. 3 hours. That's all it took. 3 hours from the moment Don Berna pulled the trigger to the moment Medellín became a war zone. And here's the decisive turn that nobody saw coming. While Pablo was orchestrating the destruction of every Cali asset in the city, Colonel Valderrama called back with the names Pablo had demanded. And one of those names was Guillermo Palomari, a Cali cartel accountant who had traveled to Medellín to oversee the logistics of the meeting. Palomari was staying at a hotel in Laureles under a false name. He had records, financial records, shipping routes, names of Cali's contacts in the Colombian military, the government, The judiciary. Pablo sent 12 men to the hotel. They arrived at 12:40 a.m. Palomari was asleep. They kicked in the door, zip-tied his wrists, put a pillowcase over his head, and carried him to a waiting van. His briefcase, containing 2 notebooks and a floppy disk, went with them. That briefcase changed everything. The information inside gave Pablo a roadmap of the Cali cartel's entire infrastructure, their European distributors, their banking contacts in Panama and Switzerland, their political allies in Bogotá. Over the next 6 months, Pablo would use that information to dismantle Cali's operations piece by piece, intercepting shipments, bribing their contacts away, feeding intelligence to the DEA through intermediaries when it served his purposes. But that's the long game. That night, the immediate reality was fire and blood. By 2 a.m., 11 people were dead across Medellín. 31 were wounded. Property damage ran into the millions. The Colombian army was mobilized and began patrolling the streets at 3 a.m., but by then Pablo's sicarios had melted back into the comunas, into the hillside neighborhoods where no armored vehicle could navigate the narrow, winding streets, and where every resident knew, to say nothing to a uniform. Pablo himself was moved twice more before dawn, from the safe house in the hills to an apartment in Belén, then to a farm outside Rio Negro. His neck wound throbbed. The paramedic changed the bandage twice. Pablo ate nothing. He drank black coffee and made phone calls until the sun came up. At 6 a.m., he spoke to his mother, Hermilda. She was at a property in El Peñol, 90 minutes from the city. She'd heard the news. "Pablito," she said. "Are you hurt?" "A scratch," he said. "Come home." "I can't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would be terrified." Pablo held the phone. His jaw worked. His free hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard his knuckles went white. And then he said, very quietly, "I know, Mama." That was it. That was the only moment all night where Pablo Escobar sounded like a man instead of a machine. 5 seconds of silence on a phone line with his mother, and then the wall went back up and he started giving orders again. Here's what happened to the key players. Don Berna survived the night. He spent 3 days in the basement of La Finca. What happened there has been described in depositions that were later sealed by a Colombian court, and I'm not going to speculate. What I will tell you is that Don Berna was released alive. Pablo let him go. And this is the part that still puzzles historians. Why? Some say Pablo wanted Don Berna to carry a message back to Cali. Some say he wanted the fear of what happened in that basement to spread through the cartel world by word of mouth, which is more effective than any execution. Some say Pablo, in a rare moment of pragmatism, calculated that killing Don Berna would trigger a blood feud with Don Berna's network that would cost more than it gained. Whatever the reason, Don Berna walked out of that basement. He limped, actually. And he would go on to become one of the most powerful paramilitary leaders in Colombian history, eventually turning against Pablo permanently and helping the government track him down in 1993. The man Pablo spared became the man who helped kill him. Think about that for a second. Hernando Carvajal, the Cali representative, bled out on the warehouse floor. He never delivered Pablo's message to Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. The gold watch was found on his body by one of Pablo's cleanup crews. It was returned to Pablo. He never wore it again. Carlos, Pablo's bodyguard, was buried in an unmarked grave outside Envigado. His family received $100,000 in cash, delivered in a duffel bag by Popeye 2 days later. Carlos had been 26 years old. He had a daughter he'd never met. Popeye, the lieutenant, survived without a scratch. He later said that the Envigado warehouse was the 3rd closest he ever came to dying. He wouldn't specify the 1st or 2nd. Popeye was eventually arrested in 1992, served 23 years in prison, was released, became a YouTube personality giving interviews about his life with Pablo, and was arrested again on extortion charges. He died of esophageal cancer in 2020. Guillermo Palomari, the Cali accountant who was snatched from the hotel, eventually cooperated with Pablo's organization under duress. But years later, after Pablo's death, he would become one of the most important witnesses against the Cali cartel, testifying for the DEA and entering witness protection. He's believed to be alive somewhere in the United States under a different name. Colonel Valderrama continued to receive payments from the Escobar organization until 1992, when he was killed in a car bombing attributed to the Cali cartel. He was 44. And Medellín? Medellín woke up on Wednesday morning to the smell of smoke and the sound of military helicopters. Schools were closed. Businesses stayed shuttered. The newspapers ran headlines that used words like massacre and siege. The government issued statements condemning the violence and promising a crackdown, which they had promised every week for 3 years. Nobody mentioned the meeting. Nobody mentioned the warehouse in Envigado. Nobody mentioned a bullet that grazed a drug lord's jugular by a centimeter. Because in Medellín in 1989, some stories were too dangerous to print. They lived in whispers, in barbershop conversations that stopped when a stranger walked in the way mothers pulled their children inside when a motorcycle slowed down on their street. The scar on Pablo's neck healed into a thick, raised line about 4 inches long. He wore collared shirts after that, buttoned to the top. In photos from the last years of his life, you can see it. The collar pulled tight, the fabric hiding the mark that Don Berna left. Pablo never spoke about the Envigado meeting publicly, but Popeye, in one of his many interviews, described a moment from 2 weeks later. He and Pablo were driving through the comunas, and they passed a wall where someone had spray-painted Escobar Vive, Escobar leaves. Pablo slowed the car, looked at the graffiti, and said 7 words. They should have aimed 2 inches right. That was it. No elaboration, no bravado. Just a man who understood with absolute clarity that he had been 1 centimeter from a severed jugular, 1 heartbeat from bleeding out on a warehouse floor in the city where he was born. Now listen, if you've made it this far into the story, you're the kind of person who appreciates the details that get left out of documentaries and textbook summaries. That night in Envigado, the bullet, the betrayal, the 3 hours that turned a city into a battlefield. This is the stuff that makes history feel real, not sanitized. If you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button right now. We go deep here. We don't skim the surface. Because here's the final piece. The night of the Envigado meeting wasn't a turning point in Pablo Escobar's war with the world. It was the night the war stopped being about money and territory and became about survival. From that point forward, Pablo trusted no one who hadn't been with him from the beginning. His inner circle shrank. His paranoia deepened. He stopped attending meetings entirely, communicating only through intermediaries and coded radio messages. And the Cali cartel learned something too. They learned that you could put a bullet in Pablo Escobar's neck, and he would still walk out of the room, still pick up a radio, still turn your investments into ashes before sunrise. The next time they came for him, they didn't send 3 men to a warehouse. They funded an entire paramilitary organization called Los Pepes, joined forces with the Colombian government, the DEA, and the Search Block, a special police unit whose sole purpose was finding Pablo Escobar. It took all of them, the combined resources of 2 cartels, 2 governments, and a dedicated military unit. It took 4 more years. And even then, on December 2, 1993, when Search Block operatives tracked Pablo to a rooftop in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín and put him down for good, the debate about who fired the final shot has never been settled. But every account of Pablo's last years traces back to that night, the night the ground shifted, the night he learned that his own people would sell him out. The night a bullet meant for his brain hit his neck instead, and he turned a city upside down in response. Medellín has changed since then. The comunas have cable cars and libraries now. Tourists visit. Entrepreneurs build startups. The murder rate has dropped by more than 90%. But if you go to Envigado today and find the right bar, and if you buy the right old man a drink and ask about the night the city burned, he'll look at you for a long time before he speaks. And when he does, he won't start with a date. He won't start with a name. He'll start with a sound, a single gunshot inside a warehouse, and then the silence that followed, and then every other sound in the world starting up at once. That's the legend. That's how Medellín remembers it, not as history. As a night when 1 man got shot in the neck and 3 hours later, 500,000 people locked their doors and prayed for morning. And it all started because Pablo Escobar sat down at a table with a man he used to trust, and that man chose the wrong side of history.